Hello, I'm Marc Hendrix from AIM Geoanalytics in Missoula, Montana. I'm here to present the third of 5 weekly webinars on the Phosphoria Formation, which is a prolific source of oil and gas in the northern Rocky Mountains and a long-standing source of mined phosphorite and mined phosphate as a critical commodity for mostly for fertilizer. Our plan this week, you can see here, is to continue this webinar. First week we introduced the Phosphoria. Last week we took a look at some of the geochemical data that separate the Phosphoria sourced oils in Wyoming from Cretaceous sourced oils. Here, for example, you can see this is a core from the Bighorn Basin cut from the Nance Alvarado Unit 26-2, and you can see this this core here has some oil staining here, as well as some different lithofacies, some chert nodules here on the right, and some laminated Dolo mudstones. So we're going to have a look at this core next week, but this week we're going to stay on the surface and examine the Phosphoria in Outcrop, and hence the title of the talk today, Lithofacies of the Phosphoria, Examples from Outcrop. Remember from last week, I introduced the Phosphoria, and in particular, we looked at the geochemistry between Phosphoria and Cretaceous sourced oils. And we spent quite a bit of time thinking about the two organic rich mudstones in the Phosphoria. Here's a chronostratigraphic chart that for across the Phosphoria Basin from the south to the central part of the basin here to the northern part of the basin. And you can see here that, again, there are these two organic rich mudstones that are colored in black. Shown also are those facies and localities where the Phosphoria itself produces oil, shown in the black dot, or gas here shown in the circle with the cross. All right. This week, what we're going to do is really start a kind of a west to east transect across the Phosphoria Basin, kind of focusing here in Wyoming, Idaho, a little bit of Utah. And we're going to be then moving up from the deeper parts of the basin, which, as we've mentioned, are likely upwelling influenced, up onto the Wyoming Shelf, where we're going to be getting into different lithofacies that are carbonate dominated. So, excuse me. Recall that, first of all, the overall distribution of one of those two organic rich members. This is the younger of the two, and it's called the Retort Formation. This is a section that we measured through the Retort Formation at a locality in southwestern Montana called Daly's Spur. And at this locality, we measured about 48 meters of retort member, and you can see that section shown here on the right. It consists basically of 3 major lithofacies. We see an organic rich mudstone here in the kind of brown color. We see a series of phosphorites that have evidence of current activity and phosphogenesis here in the blue color. And then towards the top of the section, we see actually a different member. This is the phosphatic cherty mudstones of the overlying Tosi chert. Excuse me. All right, so recall here on the left, we see the overall distribution of retort mudstone across the Phosphoria Basin, both in terms of its overall thickness, as shown here in the green isopachs, as well as the TOC, as you can see here, shown by the isopleths. And remember that the retort member is best developed here in southwestern Montana, where we measured this section. All right, this slide shows 2 photographs from the retort at Daly's Spur, and the lower of the 2 photographs, a little bit more of a close-up, shows some of the laminated organic rich mudstones. That's the lithofacies that you can see here on the fresh surface is a little bit more dark in color. These mudstones tend to weather white. They bleach when they come into contact with atmospheric oxygen, and so they typically look a lot more light colored when they've been exposed to the surface relative to what we might see in the subsurface. Here's a slightly more zoomed back look from Daly's Spur, and you can see the interbedded nature of these organic rich mudstones here, separated by the lighter colored granular or sandy phosphorites. All right, if we look at these in thin section, here's a thin section from the daily spur locality. Again, here's our measured section. Here's an outcrop photograph. And this thin section is as you can see, quite fine grained, although if you look closely, you see a number of little white dots. And these white dots are clear grains of detrital angular silt that we interpret to have been derived via aeolian transport of dust from the former supercontinent Pangaea. This dust we think was transported via the northeasterly trade winds, which recall blew from the northeast to the southwest. That's in an offshore, kind of an oblique offshore direction. And they brought this dust into the Phosphoria Basin through that aeolian mechanism. This is a very organic rich sample. You can see here we measured a TOC of just about 20%. That's getting up towards the high end of the TOCs we've measured from the retort. And as you can see also on the XRD pie chart here, this sample is surprisingly rich in quartz, and that's this quartz silt that I referred to earlier that we think is of aeolian origin. The other mineral you see here is illite, and the illite is kind of a grab bag for glauconite as well as illite that we observe, illitic clays that we actually observe in this sample. All right, if we move a little bit further south, excuse me, go back here. If we move a little bit further south out of the Retort Depot Center and into the Mead Peak Depot Center, and we also move down section into the Mead Peak, this is a typical sample of what we might find as a high-grade mined phosphorite in the organic rich member itself. So this is a sample from the now abandoned West Gay Mine near Idaho Falls, and is a fairly typical phosphorite that again would be a high-grade ore rock in these phosphorite mines. The XRD analysis shows that it's almost entirely made up of apatite, this sample, with a little bit of residual quartz. Again, this is quartz that we think is mostly aeolian and often forms the nuclei of some of these phosphatic ooids. Also shown in this slide is an outcrop photo of one of these phosphorites in the West Gay Mine, and you can see here that there are a number of pebble-sized phosphate intraclasts here, and this is fairly typical of these phosphorites. And then looking in a little bit more detail here at a photomicrograph from this little portion of the slide here, notice the scale bar 0.5 millimeter, we see a number of individual coated grains, and these are phosphatic grains. They're coated by concentric layers of phosphate, and we think that these formed at or just below the sediment water interface in the Phosphoria Basin as an authigenic process. All right, we move a little further to the south and stay within the Mead Peak Depot Center. Here's another example from the Mead Peak. This is from the now an abandoned portion of the Diamond Gulch mine. And this is quite a different facies. You can see it looks different here in thin section. It's much more fine grained. These darker sand-sized grains are actually grains of phosphate. So looking at the XRD, we see that represented here by about 11% apatite. We also see about 10%, 9% specifically of Farrowan dolomite, the iron-rich end member of dolomite called anchorite. But most of this sample is actually a limestone. So most of the mineralogy that we see in this particular sample is calcite. So even within the Mead Peak Depot Center, we see a variety of different lithofacies as simply represented by these two samples. All right, moving still further to the south, to the margins of the Mead Peak Depot Center. This is a sample from the southwestern Uinta Mountains in northeastern Utah, right here where the red dot is. And this sample is particularly unusual because it contains quite an abundance of sand-sized quartz. And the quartz, as you can see here, is very well rounded. It's typically well sorted, and we think it's being worked directly out of the underlying Pennsylvanian Weber sandstone that, at this locality, it underlies the Phosphoria. The darker grains here represent a combination of phosphatic peloids and intraclasts. There's some biogenic phosphate in this slide, mostly coming from inarticulate brachiopods. And we also see an occasional ooid, phosphatic ooid, but mostly we see peloids and detrital, biogenic phosphate here at the base of the Mead Peak along its southern margin. All right. Let's move a little bit further east and up onto the Wyoming Shelf, which at the time was dominated by carbonate sedimentation. So here's a schematic cross-section from southwest or west to east up onto the Wyoming Shelf. So we go from this upwelling related basin where we have a lot of organic rich mudstone and silicious mudstone being deposited to a shelfal region, which is dominated by carbonates. And those carbonates are largely limestone here in the deeper parts of the shelf, the outer shelf, if you will, but they become dolomitized as we get to the inner shelf, as we'll see in just a minute. Here's an example of one of the limestones from the central Wyoming Shelf. This is from the Irvine member of the Phosphoria Formation, which is the youngest of three carbonate members in the Phosphoria. It's also part of the youngest stratigraphic sequence that marks the Phosphoria. And this is a typical sample that represents what we think are little patch reefs that formed on the outer part of the shelf during deposition of this member. What we're looking at here in terms of bioclasts are largely bryozoans with the sort of the colonial internal structure here, as well as brachiopods. And these were little reef-building organisms that really were the dominant class, or the dominant skeletals that we see here in the outer part of the shelf. Again, this is a limestone and not a dolomite. And you can see that here in the XRD information. We have just a little bit of dolomite, but over 85% of the sample is limestone. See a little bit of quartz as well. Okay, as we get further up towards the paleo shoreline, that normal marine sedimentation, again, the brachiopods and the bryozoans represent normal marine salinities and normal marine seawater, but that seawater becomes much more evaporitic and much more enriched in magnesium as we get up onto towards the paleo shoreline. And that's represented here by this sample, also from the Irvine member, but collected in the northern part of the Bighorn Basin near Cody, Wyoming. And we can see this is a dolomite. Look at the XRD here in the lower left, about 83% dolomite. And it also contains quite a bit of oil staining. You can see all this brown here in the thin section scan are pores that are actually partially filled with residual oil. In addition, you see some calcite-filled vugs that we think were formed by dissolution of evaporate, probably anhydrite nodules that were part of the original fabric of this rock, but since have undergone dissolution. Here's another couple of thin section photomicrographs from this same sample. We're looking here at plane polarized light in the upper right, cross polarized light in the lower left, and reflected light in the lower right. And in each of these three fields of view, you can see that there's quite a bit of open porosity shown here by the blue dyed epoxy, as well as pores that are still filled with a residual hydrocarbon, and that's this brown material that's filling these pores right here. The porosity that we see here is almost all moldic in origin, and the bioclasts are interpreted to be mollusks. So that would be aragonitic clams and snails and debris that was relatively unstable and ultimately was dissolved following dolomitization. So you have dolomitization of the matrix, dissolution of the bioclasts to form the moldic porosity, and then charging of that moldic porosity by these hydrocarbons. Okay, this next to last slide reminds us that within the Phosphoria, we have several depositional sequences. The oldest of these is represented only by this grandeur member, and so it's incomplete, but the middle of the second sequence is relatively complete, and it consists of the Mead Peak, and then several of these carbonate several of these carbonate occurrences. This is all within the so-called Franson member. And then we have a sequence boundary here, and the third and youngest of the sequences, which includes the Retort, the Toverline Tosi chert, and then the Irvine member that we just looked at here. So That's it for this week. Next week, we're going to have another look at some of these lithofacies within the Phosphoria, but we're going to stick to the subsurface and see what we can find out from sampled cores of the Phosphoria. So until then, this is Marc Hendrix from EM Geoanalytics.